So during this screencast, we're going to look at one of the cognitive explanations of gender development, and that is gender schema theory. So, cognitive explanations. This involves how children's thinking of gender develops, so how they think of males and how they think of females. Gender identity results from children actively structuring their own experiences, so they're not just passive kind of passengers, they actively structure what they see and what they observe from models around them. As I said, it's not passive. Social learning theory would suggest that we're more passive than this, but cognitive explanations, as I said, are more active. However, there is similarities with the cognitive explanations and social learning in that they both say that children observe role models around them, obviously usually the same gender as themselves. Key points for gender schema theory. So gender identity alone provides children with motivation to assume sex stereotype behaviours. So what that means is their identity, whether it's male or female, motivates them to take on those masculine or feminine behaviours. And children do not need to understand that gender is permanent for an initial understanding of gender to develop. So gender schema theory says that this idea that gender is permanent comes a lot later in terms of their development. So gender schema theory. A schema is an organised group of related concepts. So I think of schemas as being like a box in your mind, and you put ideas into that box. Schemas are like little packets of information. So for example, if I asked you about your restaurant schema, you would probably know that you go into a restaurant, you wait by the front door, someone comes to seat you, they give you what looks like a little book, which is a menu, etc, etc, etc. So it's like a little packet of information. And we build these little packets of information, i.e. schemas, about everything, including gender. So our gender schema starts to develop at about age 2 to 3, and gender schema theory suggests that children have gender identity before they start to create these schemas. So they are aware of the fact that they are a male or a female before these gender schemas start to be created. We accumulate knowledge about the sexes, and this is through observation. And schemas allow children to select appropriate behaviours. So whether they're male or female, they select the appropriate behaviours for their gender. Children's self-perception becomes sex-typed. In-group schema and out-group schema. So if there was a male, a little boy, his in-group schema would relate to what boys do, what they wear, how they play. The out-group schema would relate to what girls do and how they play and what they wear. Developmental change as children's cognitive abilities grow, so as they become more and more kind of cognitively developed, these schemas also develop. And finally, schemas become more flexible as the children grow older. That's really important. Okay, at the beginning they're quite rigid, quite inflexible, and as they become older, then that flexibility. So preschoolers, they learn through observing others. For example, men have short hair, women have longer hair, and they write gender scripts, so they know that women cook dinner, for example. They develop in-group schemas based on their gender, whether they're male or female. So the second stage is around 4 to 6 years old, and this is where the children start to learn more subtle and complex sets of associations for their own gender. So they become slightly more flexible, they become more complicated in terms of what they know about their gender. They know their likes, their dislikes, what they should do at playtime, what's appropriate behaviour and what's not appropriate behaviour, and how they should talk. Gender constancy develops at about 5 to 6 years old. This is the idea that they understand that gender is constant over time and over situations. So therefore, at about 5 to 6 years old, they start to realise that boys will become men and girls will become women. They also know that gender is consistent throughout situations. So they start to realise even if a boy puts a dress on, he is still a boy. They start to understand what people like me do, and this becomes more and more developed and more elaborated. Okay, so that's the in-group schema. And this rule is absolute, so they're fixed gender attitude. They know that they are not going to change gender at this stage. 8 to 10 years old, so they start to develop schemas for the opposite gender. and of the same complexity. So they've now, during that second stage, they developed a more complex in-group schema. They're now doing the same for the out-group schema. Final stage, so late childhood and early adolescence, they start to understand rules as just social conventions, and those gender role schemas become more flexible. In the picture on the left, you can see there's some kind of androgyny coming out here, so they're not dressed quite as stereotypically as you would expect maybe in those first few stages, and they start to see those rules as more flexible. They can bend the rules a little bit. Stereotypes and assumptions start to be abandoned. So, without looking at your pre-reading or looking back at this video, if you can make sure that you can do the following things. So, number 1, explain what's meant by a cognitive theory of gender development. Number 2, explain what occurs at each stage development-wise. And number 3, give an example of something which the child can do and cannot do at each stage.